Welcome back. Today we're looking at a really intense piece on Genghis Khan's methods of conquest, systematic, brutal stuff, using sources like Juveni. Powerful material. Let's dive right in.
Yeah, I can see a huge amount of research went into this. You've gathered this really formidable list of Mongol tactics. The starvation, the treatment of women, human shields, trampling, dragging. The intensity is definitely there.
It really is.
But I think we can make the content work a bit harder, maybe point towards a clearer central argument.
Right. My main thought was, by laying out these horrors almost like a catalog, one after the other, well, does the sheer brutality risk numbing the reader? We need a structure that makes that brutality mean something analytical.
I completely agree. So to really boost the impact and the intellectual weight of this, the structure probably needs to shift away from just a thematic list of atrocities towards a more focused, argumentative exploration of Mongol political and psychological control.
Because right now, the weakness is that you've got these 5 distinct, incredibly intense methods, right? Starvation, shields, trampling. They're all given sort of equal billing, dramatically speaking.
Exactly.
And it starts to feel a bit like a checklist of horrors, which, paradoxically, can actually lessen the overall impact. The reader might just get overwhelmed or, worse, desensitized.
And the so what question, how did these specific tactics help them build an empire from, well, nomadic groups? That payoff seems tucked away right at the very end.
Yeah, it comes way too late.
We need to pull that forward, I think. Let the systematic nature of the violence shape the entire piece from the get-go. So my suggestion is maybe reorganizing these 5 tactics. Group them into, say, 2 main categories that really support this broader argument about control.
Okay. What kind of categories?
Well, maybe something like 1, calculated military strategy and psychological warfare, and then 2, ritualized legal enforcement and political messaging.
Ah, okay. That makes sense structurally. It shifts the focus from just what they did, which is horrific enough, to why they chose certain acts for certain situations or targets.
Precisely.
It stops being just a list of cruelties and starts becoming an analysis of a system. A system of, well, governance through terror.
Exactly. So let's think about how that might actually work, like concrete examples. The first few sections, starvation, the human shields, those clearly fit into calculated military strategy, right?
Breaking external defenses?
Yeah. Use the siege of Nishapur, the shields at Gurganj, argue that these were, practical, brutal strategies designed to get quick military results, save Mongol lives, and just terrify the enemy into submission. Maximize the psychological cost.
Okay, so that's the conquest part. And then after establishing that, we transition?
Right. Transition to a different kind of horror. The violence they used after the battle was won, or internally, to keep control.
Okay. Moving from winning the war to ruling the conquered.
They're more like demonstrations, illustrations of enforcing internal loyalty, Mongol law, the yasa.
That feels like a really important pivot.
It allows the piece to escalate logically, I think. You move from the mass cruelty maybe needed for victory to the deliberate political messaging about treason, about maintaining their code.
Where does the section on women and forced servitude fit in that? Because that's often seen as a huge psychological weapon too.
That's a good question. I'd probably argue it fits more into the first category, mass civilian control during the military phase.
Ah, okay. Reducing a population to a resource.
Yes, it's military and economic control primarily, whereas the trampling and dragging, those seemed uniquely tied to punishing specific internal legal breaches or eliminating high-status political rivals, often with ritual significance.
So segmenting it like that creates a narrative flow. First, they conquer you, then they show you the brutal system you now live under.
Exactly. A much clearer, more analytical arc, I think.
Okay, that structure makes a lot of sense.
And building on that, there's one specific detail you included that feels absolutely critical, but maybe it's a bit underplayed right now.
Let me guess, we're heading towards the yasa, the Mongol law?
We are. You've got these fascinating details in there about Mongol cultural taboos, and I think amplifying those could really explain the specific, calculated nature of the violence. It adds a layer beyond just standard military history.
I completely agree. The weakness I felt there is that this really crucial piece of info, the Mongol legal or maybe cultural aversion to shedding the blood of high-ranking nobles. It's mentioned, yeah.
Right, with Mstislav of Kiev at Kalka River.
Exactly. But it's sort of treated like an interesting historical side note.
And I think that detail isn't a footnote at all. It's almost the philosophical key, isn't it, to understanding why they chose some of the most grotesque, ritualized punishments. The constraint itself dictated the form of the horror.
So the suggestion is to use that cultural and legal context, the yasa, as a kind of foundational framework. Use it to analyze these acts that might otherwise seem just randomly cruel.
Yes, by emphasizing that the brutality was actually constrained by their own laws and rituals, it becomes, frankly, much more chilling. It wasn't random. In their view, it was almost mandatory.
The cruelty wasn't arbitrary. It followed its own terrible logic.
Exactly. Think about it. If you can't spill the noble blood of a captured prince, what does that constraint force you to invent? You have to devise a method of execution that's just as final, maybe even more terrifying, but ritually clean.
That's where the horror really takes shape. The cruelty is deliberate, it's political, and in their minds, maybe even legally justified.
So let's make that legal constraint central. Reframe that section on death by trampling. It's not just a spectacle of humiliation, it's a direct illustration of this Mongol paradox. Extreme, drawn-out cruelty serving a rigid legal purpose.
Okay, so how would we do that practically?
Well, one way might be to lead with the cultural rule. Start by stating the law, no shedding noble blood. Then show how the resulting execution, building that heavy wooden platform, having a feast on top while the princes underneath suffocated.
Horrific.
How that was even more horrific, precisely because they had to adhere to the ritual. It wasn't just brutal, it was a required performance of their law.
And we can probably link that same legal theme directly to the dragging by horses section, too.
Absolutely. That connection really strengthens the argument about governing through fear. The material notes that dragging was specifically for traitors, people who violated the trust.
Right.
We should emphasize that this wasn't just an oops, horrible accident thing. It was an irreversible, public response required by the Yasa for anything seen as threatening internal unity.
So it shifts the focus again. Not just a horrible thing happened, but this specific, dehumanizing, horrible thing happened because Mongol law demanded this exact consequence for treason.
Exactly. It makes the violence feel colder, controlled, inescapable, systematized.
That definitely elevates it. It moves from just military history into a much more complex cultural and legal analysis of how they built and maintained power. Okay, so if we accept this calculated precision in the actions, we need to make sure the style, the tone, matches that same precision.
That's a really important point. It moves us from the what of the critique to the how. Because while the writing uses vivid, dramatic language quite effectively, I think tightening the relationship between the modern narrator's voice and the historical chronicler's own words could enhance credibility and, weirdly, amplify the sense of calculated horror.
I think I felt that tension too. Sometimes the narrator's dramatic tone, phrases like, which mind is capable of creating a weapon from hunger itself? While powerful, it almost risks competing with the sheer cold power of the primary sources themselves.
Yeah.
My concern there is that by keeping the drama dialed up so high constantly from the narrator, we might actually dilute the impact a bit. It's like we're trying too hard to sell the horror, when the sources themselves, well, they possess this terrifying objectivity.
Like Giovanni.
Exactly. The impact of someone like Giovanni is huge, precisely because his descriptions are often so clinically descriptive, just stating overwhelming atrocity almost matter-of-factly.
So the suggestion here is basically trust the sources more. Let them carry the primary emotional weight.
I think so. Use the narrator's voice, your voice, perhaps to set the scene, introduce the type of tactic, the strategy, but then quickly hand over to the chronicler's language for the sharp, impactful evidence.
Let the historical record deliver the gut punch.
Yes. That juxtaposition between the often objective, almost detached historical record and the horrific reality it's describing, that can create a much more profound, sustained sense of dread than constant high-level drama from a modern voice. Let the sources breathe.
Okay, let's use the material for concrete examples. How would that work? Say, in the Siege by Starvation section.
Well, maybe cut back a little on the modern description of general suffering, The idea of people eating grass is kind of generic horror imagery.
Right.
And instead transition much faster to that specific Giovanni quote about Merv.
The one about the corpses and the dogs?
That's the one. No one was left to bury the corpses, and dogs feasted on the flesh of the faithful. That single, specific, visceral detail, delivered through the lens of someone who was, if not an eyewitness, at least a contemporary historian, it's just far more haunting than any general description of hunger we could write today.
It grounds the horror in historical testimony.
Exactly. It confirms the reality in a way a modern dramatic flourish maybe can't. And we could apply the same idea to the section on the captured women in Bukhara.
Where it mentions the chronicler talking about separating people like herds of sheep?
Yes, the notes already mentioned that the language wasn't metaphorical. Lean into that. Emphasize the cold, almost industrial scale of reducing human beings to property, as described by the historian at the time.
Show, don't just tell. The dehumanization through the source's own words.
Right. Part of what made the Mongols so terrifying was that their cruelty was systematized and it was documented, often in this kind of chillingly clinical detail. If the style and tone reflect that cold precision, letting the historical record speak more directly, I think the overall impact will be significantly greater.
That's really actionable advice. It feels like all the elements are there. It's just about refining the argument and the delivery.
Agreed. It's mostly a matter of assembly and focus now. The raw material is incredibly strong.
Okay, so just to recap the main points for the listener. First, think about reorganizing the structure around that central thesis of control. Maybe group the tactics into external military strategies versus internal legal enforcement. Move beyond just the list.
Second, really elevate the role of those Mongol cultural and legal taboos they yasa. Specifically, use that no spilling noble blood constraint to explain why the methods of execution were so deliberately, ritualistically horrific. Make it central to the analysis.
And finally, refine the tone. Sharpen the distinction between the narrator's voice and the historical sources. Trust Giovanni and others to deliver the sharpest points of terror. Let that cold historical language juxtapose against the appalling reality.
Yeah, you absolutely have all the ingredients here for a really brilliant, insightful piece. The next step is just combining those facts into that powerful analytical argument. These weren't just random acts of violence. They were strategic messages designed to govern by absolute fear.
Excellent. Refine the material based on this critique. Focus on tightening that central thesis and definitely send it back to us. We'd love to see the next version.